Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking your time today to join us on this webinar on vulnerability management and managing risk with your multi-vendors. It is a topic that is very important, and it is an aspect of cybersecurity that gets a great deal of attention, but there is a lot of nuances to this. So without any further delay, we're going to start the webinar. I do want to mention to everybody, if you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen and type your question, and we'll get to it in due time. And today we have, as presenters, we have Steve Racing, CEO of ASMGi, and Frank Yako, CIO and VP of Strategic Initiatives for ASMGi. So without further delay, take it away, Frank.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Steve, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for taking some of your time and participating in this webinar. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So if you have questions, like Paul mentioned, please chime in and we'll do those real time as much as we can. But we have a lot of content to cover today, and the goal is to make sure that we give you your money's worth for attending today. So I'd like to introduce Steve Racing, who is again, part of ASMGi and a co-founder. So, Steve.
Thanks, Frank. It's great to be here. Thank you all.
So I just wanted to kind of dig in right away. As we mentioned, in today's day and age, we really have no, room to hide from vulnerabilities. As you probably know, you hear about those constantly. They're on the news. We have those every day as we deal with things in our real personal lives as well as business lives. And so part of what we wanted to really queue up today was just how to best deal with those things, because again, the days of just operating, like we mentioned in the invitation to this, of a homogeneous environment or being able to tightly control everything that you do are gone. So part of what we want to talk about today is how you actually measure the risk that you're encountering or assuming as an organization, and then how you minimize that and measure that so that you can then reduce the impact that it might have on your organization. So just a few things that, just as we go through the discussion today, just to maybe keep in the back of your mind. So first one, as an organization, do you know what your cyber risk profile is, as well as any critical vendors or entities that you do business with? That's something that's is extremely important. Do you have a program in place to proactively manage that risk, and making sure that includes all the different things that you use to do business across technology, applications, as well as the lifeblood of your organization and users as well. Also, are those risks and the understanding of those tied into any type of compliance or regulatory requirements that you have as an organization, and how do you balance the being responsive to those and being compliant with all the other demands as a business? And the last but not least is, you can't manage or measure or manage or minimize the risk if you don't know what you have to manage. And that's where it really gets into the actual assets and what you're dealing with across your organization. So there's a lot of things like shadow IT that are out there today, or with the whole BYOD, as well as all the things that are supporting organizations now, that if you don't have a handle on that, then that just becomes another risk profile. Steve, any comments on these points?
I think, Frank, what I really connect with, or what resonates with me, is that it's complex. There's a lot of stuff, right? But it's not as if it's not hard enough to do for your own organization. I think a lot of times now you have to do it for third-party organizations as well, right? So that's there's a lot here for sure.
All right, thank you. So as we go through the discussion, we just kind of challenge all the participants to think about these things and see if we're answering these questions, or how you feel you're dealing with those things as part of the security, IT, or compliance aspects of your organization. So again, kind of continue on that. Why are you attending the session today? You might be dealing with some type of third-party risk management issues. That could be part of a supply chain, or just security risks to your organization. You're trying to really understand, how you have to respond to assessments from key clients or customers. So every day, some organizations receive assessment questionnaires that they struggle to answer because they don't have a good handle on how what your risk profile is, or can answer some of the questions from the previous slide. You might be reacting to technology risks, and that's something that, again, you should be able to manage those, but not react. No one likes to have surprises. Maybe you're trying to understand your organization's risk profile and whether you're accounting for all the different variables that are out there, and that's something else that we'll talk about in the course of the discussion today. And then also, you've probably heard the saying, software is eating the world. Everything's driven by applications or code or something like that. And hopefully you're trying to also get an understanding of how those may or may not be posing a risk to your organization. So again, if you have any questions that relate to either points on the previous slide or this slide, feel free to ask those questions or bring those up as we go through the discussion. So this is something I'd like to actually turn over to you, Steve. I know it's near and dear to your heart, and why this is all relative.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Thank you, Frank. The thing I like most about this equation is the simplicity of the math, right? So it is really all about that. But if you think about risk, and it doesn't matter where in the enterprise the risk shows up. So this applies to risk in general, right? But understand what's the likelihood that the event is going to happen, or the incident, if you will, and then you have to try to understand what impact will that cause the organization, right? So as we saw in Colonial Pipeline, like they were, the data breach happened on the IT network, but because they couldn't bill their customers, they shut down the OT network. And then the impact was huge, right? I've talked to some people on the East Coast, gas lines, all these things, right? So very, very huge impact as a result of that. But so in any event, the math of this equation and the simplicity of it, if you want to reduce your risk, there's really one or two ways to do that, right? Reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact. And what I like to metaphorically talk about a lot is, like, RDP was the number one a breachable vulnerability or exploitable vulnerability for a long time. If you want to reduce the likelihood of that, patch it and fix it, right? So, but it's not always that simple. There are enterprise architectures that require RDP be in place. And so there are certain, like, servers that are accessed over RDP, and it has to be there. It has to be that way, right? So, but the patching of a vulnerability like that drives likelihood to zero, right? So risk becomes zero as a result of that. And I think, that's a key point here. So first of all, to reduce risk, you just either reduce likelihood or reduce impact. And more than the other one increases, obviously, if it does increase. But if you want to drive risk to zero, then drive one of those portions of the equation to zero, and then the simple math will tell you, right, that's how you mitigate risk. So, and anyway, I like it, and I like thinking about it, but it becomes complex when you think about applying it to every individual scenario. That's where the complexity lies, I think.
But the important part of that is that these are within the control of each organization. You can impact either the likelihood or have a direct correlation to the likelihood or impact based on your efforts. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, correct.
All right, great. Thank you. So just kind of jumping right into the keeping that in mind, there's all types of things, and this is just a representative list of the things that are impacting organizations today. So from a business perspective, again, every day we hear issues going on with supply chain. That could be as a result of all types of factors in the world today. But certainly, if you haven't addressed supply chain diversity, or especially from a cyber perspective, have not addressed with your supply chain the cyber risk that or profile that they have, and that impacts your organization. Again, that's something that you have to be able to address or deal with. Other risks include, financial loss. Certainly anything that, you've heard about in the news with any type of cyber risk that have been results of ransomware or any type of phishing attacks. There's the potential for significant financial loss to an organization if those challenges are not dealt with. Also, brand or reputational risk. Again, same thing. If you're not able to deliver services to your clients or meet your contractual commitments, again, that can be a significant issue for your organization. From a technology perspective, and again, there's things that each organization uses internally from a technology perspective that needs to be addressed and managed, as well as all the external entities. As we all know, there's a significant shift to the cloud, which right by itself assumes a reliance on public cloud providers for some of the technology that might be supporting your solutions, or even SaaS applications that ultimately, a significant portion of the responsibility for that lies in the end user, or the supplier of those services. And then there's also the integrations. Most systems today have some type of integration with external components, or rely on data or exchange of data with other entities. And that's, again, poses significant risk if that's not available and part of your solutions, or available for your solutions. Service providers, again, we have third and fourth party and N plus. Again, it's a cascading scenario in many cases today, where again, it's important to understand how those could impact your organization and what the relationship is of that to your ability to do business. And from a threat perspective, everyone thinks of things from an external perspective and the hackers out in the wild, but also we have to be aware of the potential for insider threats and issues. There's, again, scenarios every day that happen where someone internally, intentionally might have put a ransomware into an organization because they're getting paid, a amount of money to have executed or been part of that plan. So you can't ignore those either. And then inaction, apathy, and denial. That's the scenario where, just thinking that you're not going to be affected, or this is not going to affect your organization, or it might be insurmountable, and not taking any action, or denying that, this is ever going to impact you or even a third party that you do business with, is definitely a significant risk to all organizations. And then as we go through that, there's all types of options for managing these risks, and are the things that drive why you have to do that. From an external perspective, again, regulations, those are something that continue to come up every day, and are just continually to change in different industries. From a compliance standpoint, there's all types of industry compliance requirements that are out there that continue to evolve because of the requirements or the dependencies from a supply chain perspective as well. And those are continuing to evolve, and you have to be able to do those minimum ante for even being able to transact business with some entities. Also, other reasons why you have to deal with these things is from a business commitment standpoint. So you might have contractual commitments from a legal perspective. So just the service levels that you're committed to as an organization could just very well justify, some of the expense or commitment to resolve any type of cyber risk that might impact your organization. And then from a legal perspective, again, tying it back to the SLAs or those business commitments, typically there's some significant penalties if you're not able to deliver as part of the commitments to your clients or customers. And again, that cascades up and down, that supply chain as well. Steve, would you like to comment on some of the internal reasons why you should be managing?
Yeah, actually, the first comment I was going to have was more shows up in the external list, but I think it's worth noting, Frank, that the compliance requirements are never going down, right? And we see all the time more and more compliance requirements. And like at the executive level even, right? So everybody recognizes that this is a huge problem. The security is a huge problem, right? And breaches and ransomware and all those things. And so most entities are requiring, this addresses a lot of these items, like in the contract, right? That you have to meet a base level of compliance. Like even to get cyber insurance, you have to be doing certain things. And if you don't do them, you're not getting a policy, right? So the cost of policies is going to probably go up for everyone. But if you don't do certain things, you won't even get a policy. So we're seeing a lot of compliance requirements put in place, even at the executive level, by virtue of executive orders and those kind of things. But there are a lot of people taking cyber very seriously and pushing those requirements to third parties and service providers and things like that. So I think that's becoming more common today, and so we see a lot of that.
Great, thank you. I'd like to comment on this. I know that this is something we've talked about in the past, as far as the options that you have for dealing with different types of risks.
Yeah, it's interesting, Frank. I used to, say this all the time. There are really three options to deal with risk: mitigate it, accept it, or transfer it, right? And so, and those are definitely on the list. But how do you avoid a risk? And so metaphorically, again, by way of example, if the risk is falling off the cliff, don't go near the cliff, right? I think, this is something that we have to train ourselves to think about. The best way to mitigate a risk is to avoid it altogether, right? So it's clearly an option, and it should be included. And I think if you think about risk, it's hard to imagine that there's another option, right? So avoiding it just means just don't go near the cliff, and then you don't have to worry about falling off, right? So reducing the risk or mitigating the risk is putting controls in place that affect either the likelihood or the impact, right? And then accepting the risk says, and this we tell customers all the time, if the cost to mitigate a risk is more than the cost of the risk itself, don't mitigate, right? I mean, it wouldn't make any sense. So the way that the treatment for that risk would be to accept it, and then transfer usually means cyber insurance, right? But some companies, particularly large enterprises, they carry some items on their own balance sheet, right? So instead of buying a cyber policy, they'll just say, if this event happens or if this risk manifests, then we'll just pay for it out of pocket, right? So, but it still has to be evaluated, and that to me is a strategic treatment of that risk. So, right. And I think one point is, no matter which method that you choose, it should be intentional, right? So, just ignoring it is not a treatment of risk, right? That's so. Anyway, that.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to the equation as well. I mean, these all, like you mentioned, the likelihood and the impact, those both factor into all of these choices as well. And ultimately, you have to decide just where you want to apply, which method for dealing with those. Great, thank you. So as far as the different options go, this again is taking in or keeping in mind the different choices from a risk treatment standpoint. You have the ability to either be reactive versus proactive. We definitely recommend in all cases to be proactive, and that could include the four different scenarios that we were just mentioning. But you really don't want to ever be in a scenario where you're reacting to a situation and it catches you off guard, because that can significantly impact the organization. And if you don't even know what the impact of that's going to be, it could have a significant impact on all types of things, like we've talked about in previous slides. The other is, you can decide from an internal versus external versus a hybrid model how you want to actually go about dealing with those things. And we'll talk about some of that as we go further into the discussion. But again, it doesn't have to be something that you take on internally to deal with those things. There's always choices out there, and it really comes down to what is the best value for your organization to either invest in those the methods for dealing with that, or how to actually go about doing that from a resource standpoint, as well as the expertise. And as we all know, there's not one organization out there that's not resource constrained, especially in the area of cyber and IT resources. The other is synchronized versus disparate. Again, we'll see as we go further into the discussion. This is really all encompassing when you talk about, the combination of supply chain, as well as all the different types of technologies to support your organization, and all the different types of third parties that are part of your supply chain and ecosystem. And so all this has to be synchronized across not only all that, but also multiple areas within an organization, especially when you're talking about global organizations. And then the other is from a manual versus continuous. The things are becoming so complex now that it's almost impossible to do this on a manual basis and reacting to things as just as you can get to them, as well as not having some amount of automation built in when we talk about continuous. So that's another item that it's things are getting more and more complex, or have been for a while, and the ability to do those even with manual methods or people really are where the automation is driving most of these things today. As we continue through this, again, we really start breaking these things down into all those various entities that we've talked about. So you have the third party risk, then you get into, or again, from a component standpoint, the cyber risk profile, which we'll talk about what that means in a couple of minutes here, as well as then the technology that we've discussed, the applications and end users. So each of these by themselves, have specific actions and are really the main components that are supporting organizations, but also are areas that has potential risk as well. Then we get into those a little bit. What we are recommending is that you always have to have visibility into what you're dealing with here. And that's really where having an inventory of all the entities that you're doing business with is extremely important. And we really look at that as the highest level of where you want to start in this process. Once you have some type of inventory, then you can start the process of actually management and monitoring of those entities, and then identifying where there is some type of actual risk with those by doing the assessments and evaluations. And then as you go further into the process, you can proactively deal with, as you onboard or even make business decisions of who to do business with, trying to understand what the risk of those entities are by an onboarding process that takes that into account. A lot of times, organizations are dealing with vendors that you might not have gone through this process, and there might be some catch up to do. But in order to continue to get ahead of that, we definitely recommend going through and doing this process as part of just an ongoing cost of doing business, and to get those things under control. Any other comments on that, Steve?
I think, Frank, and you talked about this before, continuous versus one time. Historically, a lot of activities, especially as it relates to third-party risk, have been very manual in nature and one-time events, right? Once per year even is, once per year or once every 3 years or so-and-so. And what we know today is that, what's true today could be untrue tomorrow, right? Literally immediately. So I think continuous monitoring of these activities, and this really applies to all of those things, right? That we'll talk about, but continuously monitoring those activities and finding a way to do it more often. But if something changes, you want to know about it, right? Because it could present an incredible risk. And today we see a lot of compliance requirements that have those things in it, and we have a lot, and we see, like, even cyber insurance, right? That's if something changes a third party, for example, you wouldn't want to lose your security policy as a result of that, right? But could, quite honestly. And so that I think this just highlights the importance of leveraging technology, because we can't possibly do enough manually to make it continuous by nature.
Right. Yeah, and that goes back to the whole idea of, even from a compliance perspective, doing the check the box type of method of something on an annual basis. The reality is anything that might have been done through a checklist or a once a year process was invalid a day or hour or whatever after it was executed, because of the frequency of things changing in today's world. So that's where this is even more important to do it, as you mentioned, continuously. So another area, as we go further into the details, cyber risk. So something that's really starting to emerge right now is the concept of cyber risk ratings and understanding, what that actually means, similar to credit ratings for an individual or even a business entity. The cyber risk rating type of assessment or profile is really just that. It's a profile of an organization and what their risk profile is, especially from an outside-in perspective. That, we call it the hacker's eye view. So if a hacker was looking at, which they do constantly, scanning the internet for individual organizations that have certain types of profiles, that then represents a certain risk or opportunity for them to exploit those risks and take advantage of those. And that's something that, again, there's no hacker out there that says, well, that we'll exclude this organization because, they're a large organization or a small organization. They're looking at how they could maximize their time and effort. And that's something that every organization out there has some type of risk profile and is becoming more and more critical, especially as we talk about in a supply chain scenario, for you to understand, what the risk profile is of the entities that you do business with. And so that's something that, again, from an outside in perspective, is becoming more and more common for even getting things like cyber insurance or even doing business with entities as part of that third party onboarding process. The other, from a cyber risk perspective, though, is also the inside out. So that's where, having an understanding of what the potential risks are within an organization, as far as the inside as well as inside out. That could also mean, how vulnerable you are to insider threats as well, which that is something else that happens. Or, the example where someone plugs a USB drive into a port and that spawns some type of issue. All those things typically happen within the inside of an organization and are things that you also have to understand, what your profile is there. The next item, from a technology standpoint, again, recurring theme, you can't, manage what you don't know about. And that's where having, some type of awareness of what your asset inventory is and all the things that you rely on from a business perspective. And then, once you have that, then you can go and actually proactively or continuously monitor, those items so that you can be aware of if any type of threats do come into the environment, or conversely, have a sense of what your actual vulnerabilities are that might exist within your environment. So, it's amazing how many organizations, might just do monitoring for, say, up, down or something, or just basic patching, but don't really go through the process of understanding what all the inherent vulnerabilities are and all the different technology components that support the business. And then as a result of that, don't even get to the point where they're going, or you have the opportunity to go and remediate those. And that can be, again, a very complex process. And then, as part of that process as well, once you identify those vulnerabilities, then it becomes a business decision whether you want to go and transition that asset, going back to the likelihood, if it has significant vulnerabilities or might be end of life, getting to a point where you can go and actually remove that threat, or figure out other mitigation options that might exist. Steve, any comments on any of these items?
Yeah, just a couple things really came to mind real quick, Frank. One, and from a cyber risk perspective, these tools that you mentioned, I think it's worth noting that a lot of people are using this, right? So you mentioned risk rating, kind of like a credit rating, and I think that what we've seen is that companies are evaluating other companies, right? So if they're their third party, they're they're running these tools against them. And if you're too risky, then it's one of those treatments of risk has to occur, right?
Right.
But so cyber insurance companies are using these tools. Other trading partners are using these tools.
Right.
How many people are using these tools? The one point that you made was the bad guys are using these tools, right? So if there is a vulnerability, it absolutely will be exploited. There's no question, because they have the same tools that we have, right? So I think that's important to understand.
Yeah, and to that point, so one of the things that becomes a symptom of, let's just say, an organization is following a company or another organization's risk profile and risk rating, they immediately get notified if their risk score changes. And that typically means that some vulnerability has been identified, whether that's a 0-day exploit, within a certain period of time, or a CVE, or whatever might have changed. That can be a symptom of many things. Maybe they haven't been keeping up with their patching, or there's been some type of breach, or maybe they've had exited personnel reductions or whatever. All those become symptoms of something that is going on out there, and that just becomes a evidence that some opportunities there from a hacker perspective, or it introduces risk if it's part of a supply chain for the entity that's following or tracking, whether that entity is going to impose a problem for them to do business with. And if they're integrated, that could even be something where that could then directly impact their, somebody's, organization as well. If that gets hacked and they get, whatever credentials compromised, that could directly impact that end organization that's doing business with that entity. So all those things are real time now. And again, goes back to why you have to proactively deal with these types of scenarios and issues. All right. So to that point, one of the things that we'd like to just throw out there, if anybody's not familiar with cyber risk ratings, is it's just part of the offer for attendees of the webinar today. If you're interested, we'll be happy to run a security or risk ratings report for your organization and up to 3 entities that you do business with that are critical to your functioning as an organization. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, please feel free to drop either Steve or myself an email, and we'll go ahead and not only run the reports, but schedule a time to review those with you. And we'll talk about this again at the end of the session. To kind of continue with the treatment of risk and the various components. Again, one of the big things out there we've talked about is all the different applications that an organization uses, and that could be COTS, commercial off-the-shelf applications, could be software as a service, or even proprietary custom developed applications. All those, especially with the SaaS applications today, you typically hear about the term shadow IT. That's something that is very prevalent out there. Many organizations don't understand where their users are going, what data, where the company's data resides, and then in turn, what risk that potentially has on an organization. So there are methods out there to help entities to identify what those actual assets are, and to go through, and then once you understand what those assets are, start to begin the process of monitoring the uses of those applications, as well as ultimately to get to a point where you can identify any vulnerabilities that those applications might have. And again, we've done prior webinars on the application security, as well as this term DevSecOps, if you're familiar with that. That basically gets into the whole idea of how you monitor and identify threats within applications as part of the ongoing work that you have to do, because of the number of dependencies there are with open source software, and all the different threats that arise because a lot of software solution providers aren't proactively managing the risks associated with those solutions. And then the next point, Steve, if you'd like to talk about end users and some of the things around security awareness as well.
Yeah, I certainly will. But I have a comment on applications that I think it's important to understand. Applications as an attack surface have really risen recently, right? So every business has applications that they use and software that they use, and they likely all have vulnerabilities, right? But it's risen to the point that the federal government, for example, has issued an executive order. It came directly from the president, right? 14028, and this concept of application security and making sure that you evaluate the supply chain and applications is just so huge, right? It's a commonly attacked surface, if you will, and so this concept, one of the concepts that I wanted to put out, this is very complex, right? So in some organizations, they build these business apps, and the life cycle of them is years, right? They're decades, right? They're some old apps. They clearly have vulnerabilities in them, but even newer modern technology applications have vulnerabilities, and they likely have open source libraries, and there are vulnerabilities in these kind of things. But all of this has to be flushed out. And the other point that I would make about that is, like, even if you outsource to a SaaS application, so we see a lot of companies now that are moving common functions of the organization to SaaS type application. But this can drive, from a third party risk standpoint, these are the questions that you should be asking that software provider, because a lot of people feel like if they outsource the application, then that company is responsible for security. And the question that I always ask companies is, like, if they get breached, whose customers' data is going to be leaked, right? Yours are. So who's the company going to call? They're going to call you. They're not going to call them, right? So this, I think it's important to ask the right questions of companies and make sure that they're doing the right thing. And that's where third-party risk comes into place. From an end user standpoint, again, it's probably the number one attack vector. It has been for a long time, and people share this all the time. Like, humans are the weakest link, right? And so we see business email compromise and all kinds of social engineering tactics, and people that are, it's easy in retrospect to look back and say, why would you do that? How could you do that? But the bad guys are smart, man. So they figure out how to trick somebody. And if they breach your network, like this is why business email compromise is such a huge attack vector, because they'll watch all these communications and insert themselves into an existing email thread. When you're impersonated, the email is coming from you, right? And so this is why people are changing account numbers and, buying gift cards and Xeroxing the front and the back and sending it via email to all kinds of things are happening, right? So it's real easy to criticize those, but it's just true. And so awareness, assessing the ability of your users to just understand, why is it so important, or understand, from a phishing standpoint or from a business, don't do these things, right? Never change an account, never give somebody an account number unless you verify they're even if it's the CFO that asks you, hey, I want you to deposit. There is a supplier for Toyota, $37 million they put into the bad guy's bank account, $37 million. And so it's real easy to say, well, why wouldn't you just say, really? You want me to change the bank account number? Why? But they did it. And these things are happening at a very fast pace. And so I think if you educate your users to what to look for, why it's important, and those kind of things, again, I think this, and a lot of it falls into the category that you talked about, is continuously, right? We have statistics that say, if I tell you something today, you're within, whatever, tomorrow you probably already forgot, right? But that's so we need to continuously do this with shorter materials and those kind of things. But it's important, I think, to do this awareness training and make sure that your users are aware of, put your mouse on the link, and it's if it's a Gmail account, it didn't come from your CFO, right? So anyway.
Yeah, and just the techniques that the bad guys or the hackers are using continue to evolve. So even though someone might have been well educated on those or had awareness of yesterday's tactics, those aren't necessarily even relevant today. So unless they're aware of and continue to keep up with the things as they emerge, then it's just like I said, a continuous process. And again, in the past, organizations might have done training on an annual basis, or even, in large, 1 hour PowerPoint sessions, and the retention rate was not there at all. So again, in order to be effective, those things have to be continuous, as well as keeping up with the various threat changes in the threat vectors. So and testing. So even though someone's watched something, it doesn't mean they retained it, and that's where the validation and testing come into play as well. Great. So all of these things are great to know about, and many of you probably already know about some of these things, but what we also don't like to do is just to not show you how those can actually be applied and what you can do to move the needle. Again, we look at things from a gap analysis perspective, and that's really what the arrows on this page represent, is understanding the current state, or doing some type of current state assessment across all those different risk areas that we've talked about, and with the different items that we talked about in each of the different sections. Also then, defining some type of future state. So once you have an understanding of what your current state is, maybe you're weak in a certain area or have to do improvement, that also ties into what you want to do, what direction you're going as a business, what some of the plans are for your organization. It might be to use certain types of applications that have benefit, but also have some type of risk associated with those. Or maybe you're automating certain things that require investment in certain type of resources to support and maintain those. Understanding all those things from both a business, a technology perspective, as well as even your third-party ecosystem, all those things that you have to define from a future state perspective, and then doing basically that delta between the current state and the future state to understand what are the things that are different, or you might have challenges on in those various areas, and then defining some type of go-forward plan to address those. And none of these things happen instantaneously, and that's all part of why we recommend doing all of these on a continuous basis, understanding that these things imply some type of investment and might have to be tied into an annual budgeting process. But then even in that case, those things are becoming more and more difficult to anticipate on an annual basis, and might drive some type of other business type of changes as well to keep up with these items. Steve, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that the future state can be defined by a lot of different things, right? But compliance requirements we see a lot. So if you're in a specific industry, banking and finance or healthcare, compliance is driving what your future state. You have to get compliant with HIPAA or with FFIC, OCC, those kind of things. But we see that popping up all over the place, right? So, in the US, privacy is a state-driven mandate, right? So GDPR requirements, if you operate globally, you have to meet those requirements. So that could be a future state to make sure that you put the right things in place. The gap is anything between what you're doing today and where you want to be. But you could make the future state about anything. It could be contractual requirements or various different strategic objectives. But we do see a lot of compliance requirements driving those kind of future state conditions. Get me compliant with this, right? With the framework. But I also want to mention, Frank, a question that came in. We have a few questions in, but I think this one is relevant to this and some things that you're going to drill into. So I just want to put this out there, and then maybe you can speak to it as you go through some of this material. Is there a checklist like a firewall or endpoint protection solution, a SIEM penetration service, cloud security solution, or other types of solutions to cover all of the bases, right? So, and when I think about this, it can be overwhelming, right? To really, where do I start? So how does a customer answer that question? But anyway, as you address that.
Yeah, I think that's one that, going back to the different categories. So, there's different, what we would consider to be point solutions out there that might address specific items. But then, one of the things that we'll talk about in a minute is, looking at it from a holistic perspective. And that's something that, you have to be able to take and look at something from a technology, what the parameters are of the program that you want to, how you want to operate and leverage that, and then have the ability to operationalize that. So that's something that we'll talk about or touch on in a few minutes. But the reality is, we definitely don't recommend doing things from a point solution perspective. To the extent you can identify as part of your planning, what your needs are, and then it becomes a matter of what are the different options out there, and that could include, like we've talked about before, whether you want to use external services or a hybrid model for meeting those needs. So so if there's other points on that, we can definitely touch on them as we go through the balance of the discussion. So to kind of further drill down into that process that we we walked through on the previous slide, really there's a couple of things that we really recommend. One is that a lot of times there's some things that are just maybe you're not proactively doing these things today, and we really recommend going through and immediately doing these steps that are identified under phase 1, and going through the process of really getting your arms around what is going on within your environment, so that you could identify where those risks are. So that could include all the different discipline, or should include all the different areas that we've talked about. So the understanding your third parties, your applications, your technology, and then also what state your end users are in. So going through that phase 1 of taking inventory across all those items, really understanding where your risks are, what that sort of assessment tells you about the current profile of your organization, going through the process of having a business review so that you can go and communicate with the business, because ultimately, like we've talked about, as far as the treatment of those risks, it all becomes a business decision ultimately. And then going through and doing some type of assessment or identification of what those critical exposures are, and prioritizing all the different things that are critical to your organization, because that again has to be driven based on business input. Once you have that, and then getting into the sort of that phase 2 is to do really an assessment across what needs to be, what those vulnerabilities are, what impact that they could have on your organization, and then doing some type of triage of that, so that the next point, which we just call a get well plan, that's where you really have that plan for what needs to be done, and going through the process of determining how to prioritize those, and putting into motion those immediate remediation activities that could have the most impact on your organization. So again, we prefer not to see clients in sort of being in a reactive mode, whether they're doing this work or we're helping them. But sometimes you get into situations where for however factors, you've had things that are significant risks and critical risks to you across that whole spectrum of things that support an organization. And that's where we really try to be as proactive and responsive as possible in recommending dealing with those. And that could include, like I said, the whole breadth of the different things we talked about, as well as even third-party application or service providers to an entity that might have potential risks or impose risks on an organization. So that's just something that you have to keep in mind, all those different aspects of where those risks could impact your organization. And then once you go through that, and it might have a chance to take a little bit of a breath, that's where you can really then start to go back through the process of determining how to best do this, so that you're doing this on a proactive basis, which we've talked about. And that's where you can do what we call a maturity assessment, and look at the different processes and programs and governance that you may or may not have in place across the organizations to deal with these items on a proactive basis. And again, that can be very complex, because there's times where it does require different assessment of roles, or you may or may not have within the organization, as well as putting those processes in place. And that again is something that you have to cross-functionally look at your organization. Once you have that assessment, then you can then define how you want to go and function going forward. And that's part of that whole program development activity. and then, then the adoption of that, and then, putting those into practice from an ongoing perspective. So, we always try to make sure that when we work with clients, or we understand, where an organization is, that we recognize that there's times where things have to be done, almost immediately. And that's really why we think that this approach is so effective to do that, and important to recognize that, you have to almost go into war room mode in some cases to be able to deal with some of the things that might be identified through that initial phase one activities.
Just a couple comments real quick, Frank, and we're running out of time, so I'll talk a little faster than normal, actually. But I think a couple of points that are worth making is, like, inventorying assets has become a critical item, and we're working with a lot of companies to do that today, right? Historically, I think inventorying items has, like, a lot of people say, well, go to accounting, because, if we use a vendor, we're paying them, right? Or,
Right.
If we have an IT asset, we paid for it. So the list comes from the accounting system. IT asset management includes a lot more than that, and security asset management and those kind of things. And I think it's important. So and again, just to try to address, like, what do I do about this? I think network segmentation, like categorizing, once you get a viable inventory of the devices that are connecting to your network, and or that you own and not connecting to your network, right? Because that's a critical component as well. Then categorize them and use network segmentation, whether it's physical or virtual, right? So there are a lot of tools available today that'll help you, build a fence around a group of assets together, right? But I think that from an attack prevention or a kill chain, you want to, if limit exposure, like, so if the bad guys are able to get into this network, they can't get to this network, right? So you can segment things and separate them that way. But I think that's a critical component to really understand. And anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's where, going through and getting, a handle on the inventory, understanding how things are set up. And, again, we know, unfortunately, sometimes there's turnover at organizations. You don't know what might have been, held over from some prior employees or departments, or however way decisions were made. So just getting some visibility to all that goes a long way to be able to deal with those potential risks.
Yeah, I think it's important to note also that the go forward model, it's moving target, right? It's
Right.
evolutionary. It's a living thing, right? So what's true today might not be true tomorrow. There may be additional requirements or additional technologies available.
Right.
In any event, it's a moving target.
Yeah, all the things, and hopefully that's evident from the discussion today, are not one-time events. They're building that discipline, and that becomes part of the program definition of how to do these things on almost a continual basis, so that as the changes do occur within an organization, you can understand what the impact of that is, and account for the potential risk as part of the adoption of even technology, or even part of mergers and acquisitions, or whatever the business drivers might be. So I know this is another slide that's near and dear to your heart, Steve, if you want to comment on this.
Well, and actually, in my explanation of this, I want to ask one of the other questions that came in. Can certain multi-vendor security approaches actually make things worse? And I smile a little bit, but what really resonates with me, and I'm hearing this constantly, right? The challenge with security today is a broken model, right? But I think, in the spirit of what makes things worse, sometimes, and this is a risk, and it's not a slam on frameworks like ISO 27001 or NIST or whatever the controls may be. I think the frameworks are great because they tell you do this, right? But the challenge that I see is that people treat the controls like projects. So do this project and then move on to the next one, right? It's a very, what we call a point solution mindset, right? And so you can be tricked into believing that you're secure, but where's the continuous aspect of it? And who's validating that these controls are effective, that they're actually working. So I think what we see is that the old way of thinking is very point solution driven. And so we see in security, we see people spending boatloads of money buying tools to solve a specific control, right? And then move on to the next project. And so endpoint security, network security, all these tools, there's people spending buku dollars on these things and are still unsecure. And I think the fix for that is thinking about security more holistically. So a lot of times we've already talked about the gap-based nature of evaluating, where you want to be or have to be and where you are, right? But the risk-based thought process. So people have been talking about this for forever, right? Just think about it like a risk-based thing. But if you evaluate strategically and very intentionally, how are you going to treat each individual risk? I think that the benefits, the system will be more effective. And so what we call it at ASMGi is a total solution. And we have a brand that we call One Team for that, right? But I think this is important to understand. It's the program plus the technology plus the operations, and the order of those matters, right? So the program defines what the strategic objectives are. So this is what I want to accomplish. This is the outcome that I want from that, and use those strategic objectives and SLAs and SLOs to choose the technology. Right. And then once you have both of those things in place, the way I explain operations is somebody has to show up tomorrow and actually do this, right? And the next day, and the day after that, and the week after that, and the month after that. And I think this part from a total cost of ownership analysis, right? When people are comparing solutions and these kind of things, the level of expertise and headcount that's required for operations is often left out of that evaluation, right? And so how are you going to actually accomplish that and do that every single day? What I hear a lot is, oh, we have somebody that's going to do that. And I'm like, they have like 1,000 things already on their plate, and you're going to put one more on there, and they've never seen a solution like this before, so don't have the expertise. So even if you have the headcount, a lot of times you may not have the expertise, right? So operations is critical that you address all of those components, but I think you have to have those 3 pillars to have a total solution. And if any one of them is missing, it's not a total solution. And that's the way we explain it is. Yeah.
Especially the operational component. If you don't have that to leverage the investment that you're making, whether that's in a service or an actual technology, you never realize the investment that you're making. So that's extremely important.
Right. And just to make sure I answer that question. So I think are there certain approaches that actually make things worse? I think that we can trick ourselves into feeling like we're secure and not actually be, right? So validating and making sure. I think security effectiveness is critical, but part of that answer is making sure that all 3 of those pillars are addressed.
Right. Well, and you could have the technology, but if it's not configured properly, or you're continuing to test or validate whether that's the case, then that doesn't mean anything if you don't have those other components in place.
Right. So we see that a lot with the cloud, actually, right? So you move to the cloud and say, hey, our security is Microsoft or Amazon, right? And then, whoops, we forgot to put a password on the AWS S3 bucket, right? The breach happens. Anyway.
All right. Well, I know we're coming up on the top of the hour here. Just had a couple more points that we wanted to make. And again, all these slides will be available for anyone that would like to peruse them after the fact. But this is just one way to also represent some of the things that we've been talking about. And again, trying to draw the correlation between the activities that have to happen across each of the different disciplines on the columns to the right. And then you could further break that down into the areas or the actions that one would need to do across each of these. And again, this is all things that, really we've touched on during the course of the discussion today, but are really breaks it down into, where the rubber hits the road and things to apply some of the concepts that we've talked about. And again, these are all things that either you can decide you want to have do internally or externally, but we highly recommend that, if you're not doing one of these, then you have a potential risk exposure within your organization. Now you do have a risk exposure within your organization. Then I know we've talked about some of the questions already. Just to, again, the special offer for everyone. We'll be again distributing the slides to everyone that's attended if you want to take advantage of this, but feel free to drop us an email as well. Also coming up, we have an event that ASMGi is going to be participating in over the course of the week of October 25th. If you're interested, feel free to look us up on that or join in some of the different sessions that are going on with that. And with that, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate your attention and appreciate the opportunity. If you want to have further discussions on any of these topics, then we're more than happy to have those on any one of those different items that we've discussed. And finally, is just additional resources. We have quite a bit of additional content if anyone's interested on all these different topics on our website, as well as some past webinars that we've done on specific items as well. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to leverage those resources as well. Thank you, Steve, for your wisdom today, and everyone who participated. And we look forward to further discussions with you on these topics. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Al.